They set the table like a stage, all linen and silver, and I walked in already knowing the script. My mother-in-law's smile was practiced. The cousins clustered like an audience waiting for the joke to land. My husband sat at the head of the table, polite as always, an island of calm I had once thought was safety. My father-in-law, Mr. Peter, who wore his lineage like a medal and his contempt like cologne, had been drinking. You could tell by the way his eyes sharpened around the corners, how words came easier and softer at the same time, dangerously elegant. The insult didn't take long. A careless remark, maybe half a toast, maybe 3 sips of whiskey too many. You know, he said, loud enough for the room to drag its attention like a needle across a record. People like her come from the streets, street garbage. Men pick them up, and then they act like they're angels. The laughter, polite, brittle, rolled through the room. My cheeks flooded with heat. I could feel the eyes slicing me, the forks pointed like verdicts. My husband met my gaze for half a heartbeat and then looked away, his fingers tightening around the stem of his glass. He didn't defend me. He didn't even blink at the cruelty. Silence is a kind of violence, too, I learned that night. I left the table at once, the click of my heels like a punctuation mark. In the bathroom, the mirror reflected a woman whose hands trembled. My throat hurt from swallowing the words I had rehearsed 1,000 times. Comebacks that could break him, pleas that could mend my marriage, explanations to explain away his ugly vocabulary. None of it fit into a mouth already full of someone else's hate. I washed my face until the water ran cold, because if I let my tears fall, I was afraid they'd carry me into a place I couldn't return from. Begging, pleading, small. But this is not a story about me begging. This is the story about how humiliation became a kind of fuel. Rage is a dangerous thing when you let it smolder into something useful. I wanted him to feel the small, obscene comfort of power crumble. I wanted my husband to know what it costs a person when you choose decorum over defense. I wanted to be more than the image he painted. Revenge, I decided, would be surgical, precise, public, and irreversible in its clarity. No broken windows, no whispered lies behind doors. I would not become what he called me. I would dismantle every comfortable assumption he had without touching the man physically. The idea took root like a quiet, steady plant in the dark corner of my mind. It promised patience. I started small. A smile that didn't reach the eyes when he spoke to me in public. A withdrawal of every tiny concession I'd given for the sake of keeping peace. The way I let him dictate baby names, the time I swallowed my opinion about renovations, the tone I used when asked to help with family matters. People notice absence. They notice when you stop feeding the machine they've come to depend on. I made myself rare in deadlines and dinners. They called me busy. They called me dignified. It was delicious. Then I mapped him. Men like Mr. Peter trade on networks, the boardroom with its velvet handshake, the charity dinners where photos are taken and reputations are seeded. He had businesses, quiet investments, a partner who loved his press. He had an ego big enough to carry his lies and a wife who smoothed his edges. I learned where he kept his calendar, whom he trusted, the one reporter who always praised his philanthropy. I watched his charity gala streams and read his speeches word for word until I could write them in my sleep. If he wanted status, I would make status unsafe for him. The first blade of the plan was public exposure, not of dirt. There was none that I needed to invent, but of truth. Hypocrisy becomes brittle in the light. Mr. Peter loved to be seen as a pillar, but his pillars were hollow. The charity he boasted about to dinner guests was a paper facade. Contractors paid late, invoices shuffled, promises delayed. I started to collect the quiet evidence, the unpaid invoices I found while volunteering, the contractor who cursed him under his breath at a cafe, the small ledger that contradicted his speeches. I transcribed faint truths into a ledger of my own. I also rewired the marriage around me. If my husband had chosen silence out of fear or shame, I would remove fear's friend, ignorance. I began to speak to him late at night, not from anger, but from ledger, clear, factual, patient. I showed him receipts, timelines, the small cruelties that had been dismissed as household disagreements. He listened, first like a man at a distance, then like a man who had swallowed the map to his own cowardice. "And what then?" he asked one night, voice raw with something that wasn't just regret. "What will you do?" "Watch," I said. I was careful. Revenge needs witnesses who will not blink, and it needs to be inevitable. By the time the next family dinner rolled around, I had planted seeds in places no one would suspect. I had befriended the contractor's daughter on social media under the guise of community work. I had volunteered at an investigative journalism workshop, offering small donations to support young reporters. I had, in the most mundane and unromantic way, assembled allies, people who cared more about truth than about preserving a man's image. That night at the next dinner, my entrance was casual. I wore nothing armor-like, just quiet confidence, because nothing flattens insult like a woman who refuses to be defined by it. Mr. Peter raised his glass, the smile already rehearsed on his lips. He was ready for the old show. He couldn't know the house of mirrors I'd built around him. He opened his mouth to repeat the old line, some small cruelty about hometowns, destinies, the types people are born into. When my phone buzzed faintly at the edge of the table, my hand found it and flicked it open. There, in the group chat he'd never imagined would be relevant, a live stream link blinked. Community Ledger, exposing false philanthropy, live. The room's chatter dimmed like theater lights. My husband looked at me, puzzled. My father-in-law's eyes narrowed toward annoyance. He called across the table. "What's this now?" People reach for explanations. They rush to plug the gap between confusion and discomfort with words. I didn't give them words. I clicked play and the room was no longer a dinner, but an audience. The stream showed sliding evidence. Photos, invoices, interviews with a contractor who, under the steady voice of the reporter, explained how the donations were redirected, how the gala contracts were issued, and then quietly canceled when the checks bounced. There were timestamps, phone records, emails. There were volunteers who'd never received promised funds. The tone of the stream was clear and legal, almost kindly relentless. It did not scream. It presented documents like a doctor presenting a diagnosis. Faces around the table shifted. Conversations that meant to smother dissolved. My father-in-law laughed first, clipped and foreign. "They'll prove nothing," he declared. The laugh was a brittle attempt at dominance. My husband reached for the remote, for the phone. He disconnected the feed. I grabbed his hand. "Don't," I said. My voice was low, and the silence that followed was sharp as glass. Someone in the room, someone I had quietly told weeks before. The contractor's daughter, a woman named Aisha who'd shown up as a guest, stood abruptly. She had a ledger in her hand, a real paper one, and she walked to the center of the room and began to speak. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that none of us could deny. "My father worked for Mr. Peter for 15 years, she said. "He wasn't paid half the time. He fixed the gala lights with his own money. He made calls and made apologies on behalf of people who never answered the phone." I brought his ledger. She put it on the table as if it were an offering. Photos fell out, signatures, canceled checks, evidence that matched the stream. I watched my father-in-law's face as his kingdom rearranged itself. He tried charm first. Smiles, jokes, the old man pat on the shoulder that had once commanded deference. But the threads I'd gathered were woven with other people's truth, and charm unravels against the rope of evidence. The guests who had laughed now looked at him differently. Their pity had an edge of distance. My husband, who had been the island of quiet, finally exhaled like a man surfacing. His apology was not the dramatic thing people imagine. No screaming, no collapsing to knees. It was a small, mortal-sounding thing, a stuttered, I'm sorry, whisper. He had been silent when it hurt, but silence cracks under the weight of truth. In the days that followed, the stream I had helped seed, through my small donations and the shaky but courageous work of one young reporter, began to take on a life of its own. Other volunteers came forward. The charity board received inquiries. A friend of ours who handled PR for local events began to distance his contacts from Mr. Peter. Men who once nodded across mahogany tables now pretended to be unavailable when calls came. I watched him lose friends not through rumor but through reason. But my revenge was never meant to be simple ruin. Ruin is lazy and messy. I wanted regret that tasted like truth. I wanted him to see how his words had shaped me and how years of small silences had shaped my husband. So I kept turning the screws of consequence, but always within the scaffold of legality and exposure. I organized a small documentary-style interview with people affected by his broken promises. I sat in the corner of that interview and let others speak. I let job loss be recorded, let volunteers speak of late meals unpaid and broken contracts. It was not vindictive. It was a ledger read aloud until it became impossible to ignore. One evening, a week after the live stream, Mr. Peter summoned me to his office. The house felt different now, colder, quieter. His charm had thinned, replaced by a brittle courtesy. "You made me look bad in front of people," he said, eyes darting away whenever I met them. "You don't know what you've done." "Yes, I do," I said. "I know what you did to people so you could be admired." He tried to bargain first. Calls to our mutual friends, threats masked as concern for family reputation, promises to fix things if only we'd handle this quietly. My husband, in the meantime, had started showing up more honestly, at contractors' sites, in meetings, in the small acts of reparation that cannot be undone by money alone. I heard him on the phone making amends that were long overdue. He began to call the volunteers himself. He started paying what his father owed, a dent into the ledger that would not erase the past, but would show a man willing to clean a mess his silence had allowed. The next twist in my plan was less a trap and more a mirror. I arranged for my father-in-law to make a keynote speech at a local civic event, one he loved because it allowed him to parade his philanthropy. I reached out to the event organizers, people I had helped and who now trusted me, not to cancel him, but to ask them to invite a panelist I thought essential, a single mother who had relied on his so-called scholarships that were never honored. She told her story with a grace that was devastating in its simplicity. "I used to watch the gala videos," she said. "I believed in the promise they made on stage. I worked 2 jobs and still couldn't send my boy to the school they said they'd fund. I waited for a call that never came." Her voice slid calm and clear through the auditorium. The room shifted like tectonic plates. Men shifted in their seats. Cameras found faces. My father-in-law rose to salvage the moment. He offered platitudes, then, because acting is instinctual to him, he offered a promise: immediate review, expedited payments, personal oversight. Promises are easy off a podium. The magic, for him, had been speaking without having to act. In the days following the panel, contracts were signed, funds were transferred, and apologies, some heartfelt, some performative, were given. The legal machinery moved as people filed claims, and the charity board could no longer ignore audits. His name was in the papers, yes, but not as a villain alone. He was a man with a reputation cracking into 1,000 honest fragments. He called me once and said, in a voice that was small and human, "I never thought," and then stopped. Victory, when it comes, is rarely the cinematic collapse of a tyrant. It is quiet and persistent. It is the way neighbors stop calling and instead text. It is the way invitations slow to a trickle. It is the way your husband begins to stand when you enter a room. For me, the sweetest part was not the headlines or the faint apologies. It was watching a man who had made insults into ordinance learn to carry the weight of consequences. Weeks later, at a small family gathering, no silver, no cameras, my father-in-law cleared his throat and, with hands that trembled, said something I had never expected. He apologized. It wasn't the grand confession of a redeemed hero. It was a small, private thing. "Risper," he said, eyes downcast. "Calling you that was cruel. I'm sorry." He tried to explain the snarl of pride and fear that lay beneath the insult, the way class and expectation had made him small in the way he hurt others. I saw shame on him, not theatrical, but human. My husband, who had once been an island, took my hand then and squeezed it in a way that said more than his silence ever had. There was a conversation, one of many, about complicity and courage. He owned his part in the silence. He admitted how easy it had been to choose decorum, how comfortable cowardice had felt until it didn't anymore. For him, preparation started small. He began to use his voice in family gatherings, to correct his father gently at first, and then with firmer insistence. He began to pay debts his father had ignored, to volunteer his time, to teach his children a different model that doesn't reward cruelty. Did my father-in-law regret everything? Regret is a long, crooked road. He regretted his careless tongue when it cost him influence and closeness. He regretted the nights he had sat at galas, smiling for cameras, while families he pledged to support couldn't sleep from worry. But more than regret, I wanted him to learn something practical, a lesson that would stop the pattern from repeating, that respect is earned by action, not proclaimed from a podium, that your words have work to do, and they must be backed by the labor of keeping promises. There were days when I felt a dark satisfaction, seeing the way his friends avoided his calls, the way his apologies were measured against the ledger of truth. Yet revenge had changed me too. I found the intoxicating power of strategizing could hollow you out if you let it. So I tempered the next steps with mercy. I demanded restitution, yes, but I also demanded accountability. I wanted to build, not just break. I made sure contractors were paid. I made sure the families he had wronged received what was owed. I wanted justice, not mere spectacle. And somewhere in that long, slow unraveling, something in the family changed. Conversations became less performative and more honest. My husband learned to be louder, to speak for me when I needed his strength, and to step back when I needed my own. My father-in-law learned the hard arithmetic of consequence. When you spend a lifetime buying admiration, you become fragile the minute the money stops flowing. He learned that cruelty is costly, and not just to others. The final scene I'd scripted for myself was quiet. On a rainy afternoon, when the gutters sang and the house had that soft, domestic smell of lemon and old books, my father-in-law came to my door with a small folded envelope. Inside was a letter, no lawyers, no PR firms, just words he had chosen himself. He wrote about his childhood, about the fears that made him sharp, about the times he'd wanted respect so badly he mistook it for authority. He did not ask for absolution. He simply said he was sorry and would try to be better. There was weight in that letter, the weight of a man beginning to learn. I burned the letter later in a small tin on the balcony, watching the paper curl into ash. The fire was not a pyre of hatred, but a ritual of letting go. I wanted the heat to mark an end to that line of insults, to close the book on being called what I wasn't. When the last of the paper turned to dust, I felt a curious kind of calm. The hunger for payback that had once filled me receded like tide. What remained was a steadier satisfaction. I had defended my dignity without becoming what had harmed me. I had pulled my husband from the current of silence into the stream of action. I had asked a family to be honest, and in the messy, imperfect aftermath, they began to try. If you ask me if revenge gave me back what was taken, no, you do not unring that bell. But it gave me something else, the right to define myself, to choose what I would accept, and to build a life where my name could not be spat out as a joke over a drunken table. It taught my husband that silence is not safety, and it taught my father-in-law that prestige without integrity is brittle. So, if you listen to this and feel the heat of humiliation at your own table, know this. Revenge need not be violent or petty. It can be patient. It can be legal. It can be kind to others whom you've used as means. It can be a light that makes hypocrisy flinch, and when it is done, allow space for repair, because lasting change rarely arrives on a single night. It comes after the ash settles, after the letters are written and burned, after the quiet conversations where a man admits he was wrong. If this story moved you, if you found in it a spark or a warning, like, subscribe, share, support the channel via the link in the description. Tell me your stories. Tell me about the humbling that made you stronger. I am Risper. I survived the table, and now I tell the truth.